Well, my uncle and aunt bought Progressive Bakery, I'm not sure from whom, about 1920. And they were immigrants, and they had come from Poland, and they first moved to Chicago, where he went to work for his cousins who had a big bakery there. And that's how he developed the skill. So then he came to South Bend, and he bought this building on Chapin Street, which is right near the Kroc Center, or would have been near the Kroc Center. And and they opened up Progressive Bakery there. There was an apartment above the store, and he and my aunt and cousins lived there. And then when my father bought the bakery, it was in 1939. My uncle had decided to move to California with the family, and my dad and my Uncle Sam bought the bakery from my Uncle Abe. They had been working for him when they first came to this country. They went to work for him, and they were illegal. So it was very interesting, and we have a couple of really good stories about that. My dad told the story of the immigration coming to get them, and the immigration caught Uncle Sam. Uncle Sam was not as wiry and as athletic as my father. They were both very short. Uncle Sam happened to be a little on the chubby side. Dad was very skinny. So Dad ran up the stairs to the apartment, got on the roof, and jumped over to the next building. Uncle Sam, unfortunately, was deported, but we were very fortunate that he was able to come back in 1937 because he married an American, a naturalized citizen who had come back to visit his family. My father, unfortunately, was considered an alien until 1957 when he got his citizenship. It's like it is today. There is no path to citizenship if you come into the United States illegally. And now we can tell the story, but he had some really good customers, one being a judge, a couple of lawyers in South Bend, and they created documents for him to show that he came in through Ellis Island. When he left Poland, he had been going to yeshiva, so we always used to call him the yeshiva bacher, and he went to Cuba because that was an entry point. He could get into Cuba. The quota was still filled. He couldn't get into the United States, so he bribed a ship's captain. He and a friend bribed a ship's captain, and he jumped ship in Philadelphia. After that, he made his way to New York. My grandmother had an uncle there, or a brother there, and then he finally came to South Bend to be with his brother. How Uncle Sam got in, I don't know. They worked in the 20s and 30s for him, and when he decided to go to Los Angeles with the family, that was in 1939. So my memories of the bakery are at 419 and a half South Michigan. They had moved the bakery to Michigan Street in the 30s, and they'd opened up a deli. When Dad and Uncle Sam bought the bakery, they didn't buy the deli. It was sold to Sam Weiss. So he had the deli in the front, and Dad and Uncle Sam had the bakery in the back. It was right near where Inwoods was, where the bankruptcy court is today. It was right there. They had torn it down, and the yard to the left of the bankruptcy court, as you're facing it, was where the bakery was. 1939 until he sold it until 1971, 72, something like that, shortly after my youngest son was born. As a kid, we all kind of worked and helped. My brother was kind of, he knew he was going to go to medical school, so he'd say, look at these hands, I can't do physical labor. Can you hear him? No, but my brother and my sisters and I, and my cousins, my cousin Harvey Weingarten and Lenny and Ed Cahal, Dad had a training program for all of us, so we all learned how to do certain things. We'd help with deliveries, clean the pans, that kind of thing. my earliest memories of it would be going down with him. I was a little girl, and he would have to check. He called it the Zoyer, and I think it was the yeast. And we would go down to check to make sure it was rising properly so he would be able to bake the next day. And the best part about it is that I'd always get a fresh hot donut. And it's very funny because I don't like donuts today. But that was a treat. That was a treat. It really wasn't a store. It was not a retail store. Most of it was wholesale. He sold to groceries. He sold to people who just walked in. He sold to all the Italian restaurants in South Bend. I remember going with him and delivering to Notre Dame, to the dining halls, and to St. Mary's, to the dining halls. And I think I told you the story that I had gone, and it was shortly after the war, and it was in the old truck. And the truck was our only form of transportation as a kid. I mean, it did double duty. And there was one seat, the driver's seat, and then he'd put a crate down in the front for my mom and 2 crates for Lorraine and I, because Larry and Sandy hadn't been born yet. And we had gone out to St. Mary's to deliver, and when we came out, he had 3 flat tires. And I don't remember how we got out of that situation, but rubber was very scarce during the war, and you could not get tires and things like that. And I think I told you that he got the first car Ben Pfefferman got, because he kept Ida Pfefferman in sugar and flour and honey and everything that was rationed, because she liked to bake. And so she couldn't get sugar. She couldn't get some of those things, so Dad would give it or sell it. I don't know. And so he got the first car. And as I told you, we got a new car and a new brother in 1 week. And we picked up Larry in that car. When you walked in, you had to go down the alley from Michigan Street, and you walked in, and there was this little vestibule, and to the left there was coal, because the original oven was a coal oven. And then you walked into the bakery, and the best part was the smell. The smell was just wonderful. It was just fresh bread and cookies and that kind of thing, and it was just really great. And today when I walk into a bakery, it brings back lots of good memories. The other thing that I remember is it was very noisy. There were 2 mixers going. One went like this, and one went like this, and then there was the bread slicer, and there was the bagel slicer. And then in the middle of the bakery, there was this big bench where the bakers worked. And then they would knead the bread, and then they'd slap it down on the bench, so that made noise. And it was just kind of a very noisy place at times. And my memories of the bakers, well, first of all, it was very hot in the summer. And it was fairly comfortable, but warm in the winter. And my first memory of the bakers, they were all immigrants. 3 were Polish, 1 was Hungarian, and then there was Dad and Uncle Sam. So they would speak to each other in Polish. They would speak to each other, Dad and Uncle Sam would speak to each other in Yiddish. Sometimes they even used English, but mostly they were all talking in Polish. And John, the Hungarian baker, he could speak Polish also. So it was just, I always was amazed at how they switched back and forth the languages. It was very, very interesting, very interesting. If Dad was talking to the bakers, he'd be talking to them in Polish, and if he was talking to Uncle Sam, he'd switch to Yiddish. And then customers would come in, and then you'd hear English. So it was really interesting. They were sweet men. They were really sweet men, and I have a memory of one. His name was Michael Kotowski, and he was about the same size as my father, short, wiry. And I remember going with Dad, and I must have been 7 or 8, And we walked in, and in the summer they wore these, they call them the wife beater t-shirts, you know, the sleeveless t-shirts because it was so hot. In the winter they wore the just white t-shirts with a big white apron. And so this has to have been in the summer, and I noticed he had numbers on his arm. And I said to Dad, why does he have, you know how a kid says, why does he have numbers on his arm? And my dad said in Yiddish, frag sich nicht, which means don't ask. And I found out later that he and his wife had been they were Polish partisans, and they had been in a slave labor camp. And so that was my very first memory, and the very first time I ever saw numbers was not on somebody Jewish, but on somebody Polish. Everyone got along. When they had to do something fancy, the baker from Dainty Maid would come in and decorate the cakes. He sold to many of the ethnic bakeries because many of them just made pastries and, you know, had showrooms. He didn't have a showcase or a store in the front to go in and buy cakes and cookies, so he was basically wholesale. My favorite item to eat was pumpernickel bread, and it still is today. And when I was a kid and I was sick, he would make it special, pumpernickel with white raisins. And you can't get that very often. Once in a great while, usually when we'd go to Florida, sometimes you can get it there. But that was my favorite thing.
It wasn't something sweet.
I'm not a big sweet eater. My dad was not a big sweet eater. My mom, my sisters, my brother are big sweet eaters.
So what sold the best?
What sold the best?
Yeah.
I think the rye and the pumpernickel bread. And today I marvel because we sold pumpernickel bread, a 2-pound loaf of rye and a 2-pound loaf of pumpernickel for 37 cents. And if my father knew what I was paying for pumpernickel and rye now, he would be very angry.
And this was in the 70s when you're remembering these prices?
Yeah, no, this was probably in the 60s, 50s, late 50s. Before I went to college, you know, I worked. And then I would work in the summer here at the day camp, but I would also help him deliver on Notre Dame football weekends. The best thing that I really liked, and my sisters really like, is the mun, the poppy seed coffee cake, the mun cake. And we went to Eastern Europe on a trip, my sisters and I. We went to visit Dad's hometown, and, you know, it was a trip about Jewish sites in Eastern Europe. And so we would scope out these poppy seed cakes. Poland had the best, so it was Polish. And my sister sends from the Russian bakery in San Francisco. She sends us mun cake.
Oh, well, that's nice.
So, yes, Cooperman's Bakery was also, I believe, on Chapin Street. Cooperman's Bakery, and I think there's some family left here that was Cooperman's Bakery, but I'm not sure. One of the Gentner girls, maybe?
Yeah.
And they were friendly competitors.
Yes.
I mean, everybody was located around the two synagogues, you know, the William Street and the Taylor Street shul. Zonenberg's was not too far. Sofin's, which was a kosher butcher shop, which Dad delivered to, was not too far, and the bakery. So they were all in close proximity to each other. It was kosher. Today, I don't know if it would be considered kosher because Dad was not Shomer Shabbos, even though he studied to be a rabbi in Poland. He had to work because he had to feed the family. Uncle Sam remained Shomer Shabbos. First of all, he didn't drive, and he was off for every holiday. But Dad couldn't afford to do that. You know, there was us. So that was that. You know, and it was great. I guess one of my memories is when I would come home from college, he would have me deliver, and he had this orange station wagon. I was maybe a senior in high school when he got it, or a junior, and on the side was Progressive Bakery. And it was, you know, I was always embarrassed to drive around with this card that said Progressive Bakery when my friends had all these neat cars. My mother was born in Russia. My grandfather came my mother's father came to the United States in 1913. He came with his nephew, and who was as old as he was. And they came, and he was always going to make money and go back and be a rich man. You know, that was what we heard. But thank God for the Russian Revolution, and that took care of that. And in fact, I have some Russian rubles that he had bought in anticipation. They're hanging on my living room wall. But so in about 1922, my grandmother, 1921, my grandmother, there was this pogrom, and my mother lived through this pogrom, and she was very, very lucky that she escaped. She lived with me at the end of her life, and she relived a lot of that, and it was really scary, and that's how we found out some of the things that happened. And so my grandmother decided she would take the 4 kids. It was my Uncle Abe Cahal, my Aunt Rose Weingarten, and there was another brother, Joseph, and my mother, and they would come to the United States. So they walked, and they took a train when they could, but they did a lot of walking. And when they got to the Polish border, there were the same kind of coyotes that you see bringing South American or Central American immigrants, and they split them up into 2 groups. So my mom and Uncle Joe, because they were the oldest, they went with one group, and then my Aunt Rose and my Uncle Abe were the youngest, the younger 2, so they went with my grandmother. And my mother said that they were really worried they'd never see each other again. And then they ended up in Warsaw, and thank God for Hayas, because Hayas made sure they had money, they had accommodations, and they made the arrangements for them to come to the United States, and they came in November of 1922.
Can I ask one more progressive question?
Sure.
Why was it called Progressive Bakery?
I have no clue.
Okay.
I have no clue if when Uncle Abe bought it, it was already Progressive Bakery or not. When he moved to Michigan Street, before Daddy bought him out, and he had the deli was called Cohn's. You know, they all changed their name to Cohen. My uncle changed it because his cousins had changed it. My dad changed his name from Oken to Cohen because he thought maybe the immigration wouldn't find him. You know, because Cohen was such a common Jewish name. My Uncle Sam never did. And now my cousin Mario in Israel, he's the only one that carries the Oken name.
Can I ask some questions? Did you have clientele outside of the Jewish community?
Oh yes, because from Notre Dame, St. Mary's, he had some judges. You know,
Just look at me.
Oh, he had, you know, a lot of business people that that worked in South Bend would come.
So a lot of businesses were not Jewish owned.
Of course, and he had a lot of Polish clientele because this was kind of a Polish bakery kind of thing too, Jewish, Polish. I noticed when we were in Poland, everything was very similar. My sisters commented on that too.
To the way things worked at Progressive.
Yeah. The types of breads, the types of coffee cakes, the types of pastries. Well, there were lots of, we went to Hebrew school at the Hebrew Institute, and I remember, since Dad got up at 4 o'clock in the morning to go to the shop, then he would come home at noon, and he would have a big lunch. We had our big meal at noon, and then we would come home from Madison School. It was walking distance. So we'd have our big meal at noon, and we'd go back to school, and then he would take a nap. And we'd be home by 3:15, 3:30, and at 4 o'clock Hebrew school started. He would sleep till then, and then we would go to Hebrew school. And afterwards, after Hebrew school, sometimes we'd go to the bakery, but my grandparents lived about 3 doors away from the Taylor Street Synagogue.
This is your mother's.
my mother's parents, and we had lived with them until I was about 4. And so we would go to Bubby and Zadie's house, and she would feed us, and Lorraine and I, and then Daddy would pick us up, and we'd go home, and that would be that. Sometimes they would have like a Purim party
Right.
for kids. I know there were all kinds of activities for adults at that point. I remember they had a big case as you walked in, and it had Judaica. And I remember that's when Dad bought the Hanukkah menorah. He bought us a Hanukkah menorah because
Oh, it was a
at,
gift shop, like
a gift shop, a gift case. It wasn't a shop, it was a case. And one Hanukkah, the menorah broke, the shamas fell off, and we were a little upset, you know. You figure you're not going to get any gelt if you don't have a menorah. And so he says, listen, in Poland we didn't have menorahs. I'll show you what we're going to do for the shamas. We used the regular menorah, and then he went into, our house had a room off the kitchen. We called it the summer kitchen. It was unheated. And he got a potato, and he dug it out, and we called that the potato Hanukkah. That was for the shamas. And the next year he brought us home this menorah, and I have it. My sisters and brother and I were rather possessive about it, but I was the oldest, so I took it. I
Beat
figured.
him off with a stick.
I did. He brought home this menorah, and it played Hatikva. You wound it up, and it was just a silver menorah, but an alloy. It was, you know, we couldn't afford
Not sterling.
sterling, and it played Hatikva, and he brought it home, and it was really cool. And he says, you know, I bought this menorah because it honors the state of Israel. And this is the Israel song. He didn't say anthem. I don't know if he knew the word anthem, but he didn't say anthem. This is Israel's song. And he said, now there's a place where all Jews can be safe. And as a kid, I was maybe 8, 9, I didn't know what he meant. I didn't know that he lost 2 sisters and their families, and a brother, and aunts and uncles and cousins in the Holocaust. So
Because they stayed behind.
they
with
stayed
you.
behind. They stayed behind.
So there was a big family.
There was, and a lot of my grandfather's brothers and sisters came to the United States. So there is a big family that we have no clue. You know, we know names, but we really don't know, because they're scattered all over the country.
Oh, interesting. Back to the Hebrew Institute, and so who else was in Hebrew school with you, and what? Who?
Oh, Harlan Katz. I used to have pigtails, and he'd pull them. To this day, I don't let him forget it. And Fred Kahn, Michael Liss. Fred, Michael, and I went to Madison together.
Wait, Fred Kahn married to Marcia.
Marsha, right.
Oh, okay.
I've known him since I was a little person. And he's almost like a brother, you know. And let me think, who else? And of course, my sister Lorraine went. Ronnie Zupkoff. Do you remember Ronnie Zupkoff? And they lived next to the William Street Shul.
What about what other families?
So did everybody in the neighborhood all go there?
Everybody was coming from all over, you know,
To go to Hebrew.
to go to Hebrew school.
Yeah, but that was the one place.
That was the one place, and it was usually Hebrew Orthodox and Sons of Israel and Sinai. So the kids all went there, because Sinai, the original Sinai, was not too far down the street either. The synagogues were there. There was the Hebrew Orthodox on Taylor Street, and we called it the Taylor Street Shul and the William Street Shul. And on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, people would wander back and forth. You didn't have to have tickets, and you could go visit your friends and that kind of thing. And then you'd go down to Sinai. It wasn't so accessible at Temple. You couldn't really do that. But that's how they did it.
And Temple was farther away
Temple,
distance-wise,
Temple.
right?
When I was a kid, it was where it is now. It was before I was born. It was in that area, but
Did you have friends then in all the different shoals? And
yes. It was. I mean, we just all knew each other. It's like today. Everybody kind of knows everybody, no matter where you belong.
And there were a lot of.
There was I remember across the street from my grandparents, there was a grocery store, and it was Mrs. Goldberg. Just a little store, like in her house, kind of thing. And then there was the building the house next door to the Taylor Street Shul. They called it the Nahasorgim House. And I remember when Rosenmeyer Czar came from Poland. They were in a DP camp, and my grandparents sponsored them, because she told me that many years later.
But this was a place for immigrants, and where the rabbis stayed when they came.
Right.
And what did you say it was called?
I'm not sure whether that's in Yiddish, Nahasorgim, something like that in my mind. I'd have to figure it out.
So right next door to the synagogue.
Right
a
next
place
door
for
to the
people who needed-
synagogue. And on the other side, the Sklambergs lived. Do you remember Eddie Sklamberg? Okay.
which schools did everybody go to?
Well, we went to Madison. We lived on Forest Avenue. We went to Madison. Around there, I don't know. Franklin, I think, might have been.
Kids went to public school.
The kids went to public school.
No matter which synagogue they were at.
Right. Everybody went to public school, and everybody went to Hebrew school.
There was no such thing as a day school.
No. The day school started, I believe, when my son Jonathan, who is 51, was going to kindergarten. You could walk from that area to both kosher butcher shops. You could walk to the bakery, both Cooperman's one way and Progressive the other way. You know, it was just, you could.
And Mrs. Goldberg's grocery store.
And that was just a little place where you could get incidentals. And then there was an A&P.
Oh.
I can point out if I saw it where it was. There's a building there now, but
It was in the Western and Chapin neighborhood.
Western Avenue and Main Street, I believe,
Okay.
there was an A&P.
Okay.
Having been brought up at Hebrew Orthodox, it was not as Orthodox as Hebrew Orthodox is now, but it was still pretty Orthodox. The men sat downstairs and the women sat upstairs. And finally, I remember in the back of the downstairs, they made an area for women like my grandmother who had had a stroke that could not climb the stairs anymore. I remember going there on Simchas Torah and on Purim, you know, on Simchas Torah with the flags and everything. My brother's bar mitzvah was there.
Well, what was the expectation for you? Were you expected to one day go into business or just get married? Or
My father wanted us to go to college. This was, once we graduated from high school, my sisters and brother and I, everybody went to college. He worked pretty hard to send us there. Of course, we all worked too. I remember him saying that, you know, one day, honey, you're going to get married. One day, Tochter, little daughter, you're going to get married, and your husband may not make a really good living, so you may have to work. Or you may get a divorce, and you have to, I mean, he was pretty progressive. You don't know. You may get a divorce and you may have to support kids, or your husband could die. So you have to get out of college knowing how to do something. So I became an educator. My sister has a PhD. My other sister has a master's. My brother is an MD, and I'm the dumb one. I only have a master's, a bachelor's. The neighborhood you're standing in now used to be a very thriving Jewish area with Jewish businesses and, 3 synagogues, Sinai, Hebrew Orthodox, and William Street. And it was just very interesting. It was just there was some Polish
Jewish and mostly Polish.
and Polish, some African American. More after I had the kids, it became more African American. And then, of course, where my grandfather's house was is part of the parking lot for the Kowaleski Stadium.
What happened? Where did the Jews go? Why did they?
They just moved out of that area. Many, everybody wants to move up, I think. And their children moved up, and so they moved out.
But people are moving in again.
Right, right.
What would your father think about those new condos near the stadium? Do you think?
I don't know what he'd think.
Oh, it's a Jewish.
He could basically see them from the bakery.
Yeah, yeah. Would he recognize anything?
I don't think so. He died in '85, so he saw a lot of change. He did see a lot of change.
Could you just talk a little bit about the other ethnic groups that were in the area? Because not everybody on the scavenger hunt necessarily is going to be Jewish.
Well, going down Western Avenue was Polish. That I do remember. One side was Polish and one side was African American.
Going out west.
Going out Western Avenue. Harvey's dad had the Jack Frost Window Company, my aunt and uncle, and that was on Western Avenue in the 3000 block. So to your right was all African American, to your left was all Polish
Were most
areas.
of the businesses owned and operated by men, or did women have part of the? What was the women's role at this time?
I don't know. I know my mother didn't work.
This is Jerry.
This was not, But my Aunt Rose, Harvey's mom, worked. She worked all the time.